All right, welcome back to the channel. Now, for those of you who are regular viewers or subscribers, you might have seen one of my recent videos, which was 10 rules of thumb that will help you improve your chess immediately. And in the comments section, a lot of you guys said, we love this content. Can you please make more videos like this with more rules of thumb? And so that is exactly what this video is. 10 more chess rules of thumb. So these are super powerful. My name is Philip and I reached 2,100 ELO in classical chess through these principles. So I promise you they will work for you. They're universal. They just apply so well in every chess game. And one final disclaimer before we start. I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of variations because we could be here all day. I need you guys to trust me, apply them to your games, and you will see your chess level improve. Okay, so the very first one is create Luft for your king on the back rank. So Luft is air, and it prevents back rank mates. So back rank mates, for those of you guys who aren't aware, is if that rook moved up, black gets checkmated because the pawns block the king from escaping. In this case, white doesn't have that issue because the king can escape to h2. So you might be thinking, why in this position would we bother playing a move like h3? The thing is, with these types of middle games, there's two ways to think about it logically. In these middle games, the position is going to open up before you know it, and things will start getting traded, and the files will start opening, and the tactics will start happening, and you will risk getting checkmated on the back rank. The other logical reason is if you look at your pieces, they're actually all on really good squares, and your pawn structure is stable, so you don't really have too many moves that you could play outside of just simply improving your position, and this is one of white's best moves in the position according to the engine, and this stops any tricks from happening. So let's take a look at what happens if black plays c5. Now before that, I will just say the engine gives h6 as the best move for black for the exact same reasons, and I'll show you what happens if black plays c5. The rook takes, and then after the rook trade here, check, the queen takes back. Black thinks, I have now recaptured that pawn and I've got an equal position and I've equalized. The problem is queen d8 check. Now that forces the queen to drop back to f8, but since the queen is no longer on c5, that c7 square, which is a key square for infiltrating the opponent's position, is no longer protected, and that white queen now slides back, and it is game over because white is going to collect these pawns, or at least one of them, and win the game. This is a winning position for white, and that's how quickly things can open up, and that's why you want to create Luft for your king on the back rank. So that's rule of thumb number one. Rule of thumb number two is don't exchange bishops for knights unless you need to. So in this position, black's bishop is looking at white's knight, and white's bishop is eyeballing black's knight. Neither of these two bishops want to exchange for the knight because the bishops are very strong. They're active pieces. As the game unfolds, they're going to be very useful. You do not benefit at all trading the bishops for the knights, unless it gives you some sort of advantage, like it helps you win a pawn or helps you double your opponent's pawns or ruin their pawn structure or whatever. In this case, it absolutely does nothing for black to take that knight. It just gives white a very powerful bishop on f3. Likewise for white. White does not want to capture this. Now, we'll come back to that position in a minute, but we'll quickly switch over to rule of thumb number 3, which is protect your fianchettoed bishop. And a fianchettoed bishop is this bishop on a long diagonal. It's usually a very, 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 very powerful piece. I promise you. Like, again, it doesn't look very powerful, but it is. It's super powerful. So what you want to do is you want to protect it. You don't want your opponent, in this case white, is threatening to play bishop h6 and trade off that bishop. So you want to play something like rook to e8, so that when your opponent plays bishop to h6, because as the defending side, or I wouldn't say defending, but as the side that doesn't have the fianchettoed bishop, it's in your interest to get rid of that bishop because it's super powerful and it actually leaves weaknesses around the opponent's king side if you get rid of it. In this case, bishop h6 can be met, if you like, with bishop to h8, and now your rook is no longer on f8 hanging because you moved it out of the way. So that's a good way to protect your fianchettoed bishop, by sliding that rook away from f8. Now if we go back to this previous example, black has a queenside fianchettoed bishop, and like we said, it's very strong, and black does not want to trade it for no reason. If black played something silly like bishop to c6, white would play knight to e5, threatening to trade it. Like we said, that bishop is stronger than that knight at the moment. So that bishop drops back, but then white can force a trade with bishop to f3. And now white succeeds in getting rid of that fianchettoed bishop, and white just has a really good position now. Active queen and a whole bunch of weak light squares in black's position. So rule number 3, protect your fianchettoed bishop. Rule number 4, the best square for black's kingside bishop is, funnily enough, e7. And this is one of these, you need to play a lot of games or watch a lot of Grandmaster games to realize that, funnily enough, it somehow is. So I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of variations again because we're on move 3. But as the game unfolds, that is the square that is most useful for the bishop to be, because it protects that knight on f6 and gives black's kingside a whole bunch of stability. It's counterintuitive because, on the other hand, white's least attractive square for that king bishop is e2. It's just so passive. But the reason is, and this is the key point, white in most openings will be able to get a bishop up to g5 before playing e3. And once that bishop is there, it forms a very annoying pin on that queen, and the only way to break that is e7. As the game unfolds, you want that bishop defending that f6 knight, and again, as things open up, that bishop can come to life later, but it's not going to come to life until later in the game, and so the best square is usually e7. In this case, there's an example. Black decided to move the bishop to b4 out of the opening, and it's black to move here. The engine just says, plain and simply, your best move is to move the bishop back to e7, because this pin is just so annoying, and white is going to create a bunch of threats and maybe play something like d5, making the most of that pin if the bishop's not there. Now, an exception to this, I will say, is the Nimzo Indian defense. It's a very solid opening for black, and that centers around moving the bishop to b4. But I will say that is an exception. And even in the Nimzo Indian, most of the time, once the dust settles, that bishop ends up coming back to e7 anyway. Okay, rule number 5. The best squares for the rooks are c1, d1, and e1. And it just depends on which files you think are going to open up in the center of the board. That's where you place your rooks. So in this case, it's very likely that these 4 pawns will get traded. And so white wants to put a rook on c1 and a rook on d1. And an example is, once these pawns get traded, just the example line, these rooks are now on very powerful squares. And that's usually why you move your rooks last as well, once you've cleared your back rank for your rooks, because you start understanding which pawns are likely to be traded, and then you can either move your rooks to just to the appropriate squares. So in this case, an example of something that's not good is rook a to e1, because what you're doing is you're putting that rook on a less than optimal file. Nothing's going to happen on that e file anytime soon, and you're blocking in his brother. So you want that rook on c1 so the other rook can float around to d1 or e1. And the same principle applies for black. And if you've made it this far into the video, why not drop a like or even subscribe? You'll get notified when I post more videos like this. So number 6, rule number 6, when in doubt and stuck for ideas, look for your least active piece and get it to a better square. So in this case, white has some well-placed pieces, but white's running out of ideas, thinking, how can I continue improving my position? Well, white has two pieces that are not very active, and simply activating these pieces is the right approach in this position. And the computer actually likes both moves, knight to d2 and bishop to d3. In this case, we can play bishop d3, threatening to take on f6, and then checkmate the king on h7. And after g6, we simply play knight to d2, and we have improved our position. Nice and simply, look for your least active piece or pieces and get them to better squares. Now let's take a look at one more example, and I personally like this one quite a lot actually. Black to play and improve his position. And if you kind of look at black's pieces, they're on decent squares. The queen, you know, I don't know, is it doing too much? Not really at the moment. It's a bit restricted as well. It can't really go many squares. But that bishop on e8 sticks out as a bad bishop firstly, because it's on the same color squares as the pawns, but it's also not doing anything. And black just has a very elegant move. Again, see if you can spot it. But without calculating, you can kind of see that black's best move in this position, and the engine confirms it, is simply bishop to b5. It activates that bishop, and after white trades it off, now black's knight has two very juicy outposts, and after something like rook ac1, the other rook joins, and black has a whole bunch of pressure on that c file, a whole bunch of pressure on the b file. The c4 and e4 squares are strong, and look at black's position. It's just super nice. In the space of 3 moves, black's position is in perfect harmony, and that all started with identifying what's your least active piece and just trying to make it more active. Okay, rule number 7. This is a very tricky one. The weakest square in your position is likely going to be that f2 or f7 square. And again, this will depend on the position. You know, you might have a pawn on e3 or a pawn on e6. The position changes, but generally this is the weakest point in your position. This is the soft underbelly. And I'll give you an example of what can happen if you don't watch out for this weakness. Now this is a weakness because it's usually just the rook and the king that defend it, and you don't want your king to be your last line of defense in that position. So I'll give you an example of what can happen if you're not careful. If black played rook to e8 in this position, now it's only the king that's defending that square. So white has a brilliant sacrifice, bishop to f7, threatening to take the rook, so the king takes, and then after knight to g5, you see black's position completely collapse. First and foremost, white can just win the queen because the queen's trapped with knight e6, but in this case there's something better. Queen to b3 check, threatening a smothered mate, and after d5, knight to d5, black's lost. You know, here's an example. And then you get the most beautiful checkmate in chess, the smothered mate, forced of course, queen to g8, beautiful sacrifice, the rook takes, and knight f7 checkmate. So rule of thumb number 7, watch your f2 and f7 square at all times. It is often a weakness. So rule number 8, avoid pins on your queen and your knight. So in this case, white wants to avoid that bishop coming to g4. Now, if white castled, black would have a much better position by playing bishop to g4, because that knight is threatening to jump into d4 and just win the game plain and simply. So you might say, well, hang on a second, doesn't white have the exact same situation in this case here? Well, here's the interesting point. Like we said, black should play that bishop on e7, and that stops any tricks. But in this case, white has not played the bishop to e2, instead played the queen to e2, and the bishop is off to the side on c2. Now, this bishop to g4 is an actual threat, because here's an example. Rook f to d1, attacking the queen. The knight jumps in, attacking the bishop and the queen and the knight. And this just creates a whole bunch of chaos. The queen has to move and protect that bishop and knight. And after the bishop takes, these double pawns are super weak. Knight h5 comes in, the bishops gets traded, and then look at this. Black just has a monster couple of knights, and that bishop is just off to the side on c2 doing nothing, and black's just winning in this position. So avoid those types of pins if you can on g4 and g5. Rule of thumb number 9, get your bishop outside of the pawn chain. So in this case, both sides have the same pawn structure. The only difference is white has entombed his own bishop by not getting it outside the pawn structure, whereas black has a much more active and influential piece on f5 because that bishop is outside the pawn structure. So you want to get your bishop outside the pawn structure. In this case, white's pretty much got only one real attempt to get that bishop active, and it's c4, and we can try get that bishop onto a healthier diagonal down the line. But again, white should try to get that bishop out to f4 or g5 in most openings, and if not, maybe fianchetto it or get it onto c3. So that's rule number 9. And rule number 10, I don't have a position to show you guys for this, but it's simply this. It's a piece of advice, which is don't play for tricks. Play to improve your position instead. The tricks will naturally come. And by tricks, I mean when you're trying to set up little tactics here and there, and you play weird moves hoping your opponent doesn't see your tactics. I promise you the best way to play is simply to play improving moves. Like, let's go back to that first example. Where was it? This one. We're not going to try to play for tricks. We're just going to play h3, create a bit of lift. It improves our position, and we're more likely to have the tactics fall in our favor, like we saw with that exchange where the queen ended up on c7 without playing for tricks. We just play to improve our position, and our opponents will make mistakes. So the less mistakes we make and the more improving moves we make, it just increases the chances that we're going to make less mistakes, our opponent's going to make more mistakes, and Moneyball style, we're going to have more likelihood to win the game. So there you go, 10 more rules of thumb. I hope you guys enjoyed these as much as the previous one. If you want to check out the first video, here's a link right at the end of this one. Click on that, enjoy, have fun, and see you guys in the next video. Peace out.